so we'll go straight to our first, so there's no local board input? No. We'll go straight to our first report, 8.1, Auckland Council submissions on the planning and natural environment bills. I'll move the motions, and Councillor Ferry, Deputy Chair, would like to second, and then we'll have Karen and Dave, Louise, Dave, Karen, John. I think everyone will know you all, but if you could just introduce yourselves again for those who may not know you, and your roles, and then we can go through again a bit of a high level what we went through the workshop. So just want to acknowledge we did have quite lengthy discussions at the workshop. The workshop is publicly available, so we hopefully won't go into too much detail here, but we're happy for the discussion to continue. So kia ora.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou. Ko Louise Mason tauku ingoa. I'm General Manager of Policy, and you would know John Dugood, General Manager for Planning and Resource Consents, and we also have Karen Kirk, Principal Advisor from our Strategic Policy Advice Unit, and Dave Allen, who is our Manager for the Natural Environment Strategy Unit as well too. John and I will give a very short overview of the bills and the proposed submission. I just do want to acknowledge Dave and Karen and also the team behind them that have put together the quite extensive submission. It has been a tremendous amount of work in a short time frame. Our presentation today will just give you a short overview building on the workshop presentation last week. So the Planning Bill and the Natural Environment Bill had their first reading on 16th of December last year and have been referred to the Environment Select Committee. The closing date for submissions is the 13th of February 2026. Oh, I should also note that we do have Helen Shaw from Watercare here as well too if there are questions later. Our presentation today will give you a very brief overview of the government legislation package that is to replace the Resource Management Act. This will be rolled out quickly after enactment, which is scheduled for the middle of the year. We'll also signal matters of interest throughout this overview before getting into analysis and the draft submission points outlined in our committee report. The government's view is that the current system is not delivering the best outcomes for communities or the environment. It's too complex and too costly to navigate. The reform, though, is also intended to support government's objectives relating to economic growth, housing, infrastructure, primary industries, the environment, and climate change. And ultimately to help unlock growth, reduce the costs of infrastructure and protect the environment, while also freeing up property rights so landowners have certainty and control over their land. And our slide here outlines many of those key features of the reform. There are a number of elements to the proposed legislation or to the draft legislation. We have a planning bill which is focused on enabling development and regulating the use of land, a natural environment bill which focuses more on managing the impacts from the use of natural resources and protecting the environment from harm. And each bill sets out goals that define the intended outcomes for the system. National instruments will provide directions to councils for us to align our plans and consenting decisions with these goals. There will also be an integrated regional plan. This will implement national direction and will incorporate regional spatial planning, natural environment management and land use provision. You'll see in your committee report there's a funnel diagram that shows all the different elements of the proposed system. The idea is that it's intended to narrow decision making at each level so that earlier decisions can't be relitigated. However, I think it'd be fair to say that we have some concerns about this, about whether that system will function in reality. It's very quick implementation for the first set of documents. We are concerned that there won't be complete information. There's no proper purpose statement, as in the RMA, and no principles like the RMA, but there is system goals without a hierarchy. So, in terms of our sort of overarching view, and just noting these bills are, as I said, are expected to be enacted in the second half of 2026 before the general election, we do acknowledge that the resource management reform represents central government really wanting to do a paradigm shift in this area. And we're aware of that there are shortcomings in the current resource management legislation and its interdependencies with other legislation. Broadly, we could say that there are elements that we do support of the central government program, particularly around improving efficiencies in the resource management system, but, and this is the caveat, provided it provides robust long-term protection of the natural environment, fulfilment of te tiriti obligations, support for Māori outcomes and the public interest, alongside process and efficiency improvements. So some things we do support, but some very big caveats there around the proposed legislation. The amalgamation of key regional planning elements into a single combined plan with a long-term spatial plan front and centre, we do think will be a game changer for New Zealand. Auckland has already benefited from this approach through amalgamation and its establishment as a unitary authority in 2010. But the implementation of the new system will be critical to determine whether it will be efficient and cost less. Will there be unintended consequences? For example, will the regulatory relief provisions work in practice? So in terms of the areas of general support, and again on this slide we've just outlined what those main areas are, we do support mandatory spatial planning. As noted, we're already required to develop a spatial plan. And we support this additional provision for infrastructure, but funding and financing issues still remain. For example, how will this work with the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act 2020, an associated amendment bill, the Local Government Infrastructure Funding Amendment Bill, and the government proposals for a development levy system. So this outlines really the areas where we are in support, and John's now going to outline where we have areas of concern in the draft submission. Over to you, John.
Great. Kia ora tātou. So, as Louise mentions, there are areas of areas that we do support in the draft submission, and just running through some of the areas now of concern. Possibly very near the top, they're not in any particular order, but there is a big concern around the timeframes. So, broadly support the government's intention to move things along relatively quickly, but we feel that the timeframes set out in the bills are unworkable. For example, and probably one of the biggest concerns is some of the national direction, which is coming from government under this legislation, or would come from the government. Council would only see that for a very short period of time before having to put out its own plan. And in fact, some of the national direction wouldn't even be available for the Council's first regional spatial plan under the new legislation. So we just don't think that the timeframes that the government is setting out are workable. You know, fast and bold is good, but we really need to see that national direction before having to put out the Council's own plan. Moving beyond the regional spatial plan, which is a requirement under the planning bill, the requirement to prepare the combined plan itself, effectively the replacement for the Auckland Unitary Plan. Again, the full suite of national direction, which we have to give effect to in our own plan, we'd only see for a very short period of time. So we just feel that that sequencing of the national direction relative to when Auckland Council and other councils have to prepare their plans just isn't workable. It needs to be thought out a bit more carefully with a bit more time. The reduced opportunity for plan input. So there is a real move towards focusing submissions, or only enabling submissions from individuals, Auckland-based individuals. So interest groups, for example, would be restricted in their ability to input into plan making and subsequently into resource consent. So narrowing of opportunities for who can make a submission, who can get involved. So we feel that that is, has really gone a bit too far in terms of excluding interests who would like to get involved in things like the Auckland combined plan under the new legislation. The plan-making function is reduced, so that's the council plan-making function. It would be reduced under these bills. By that, we're partly referring to the national directions and the national standards. So a lot of things will be set nationally, and then councils such as Auckland Council would simply have to implement those through its own plan. So we feel that that's also gone a bit too far in terms of the government being too specific, taking over too much of that local plan-making function. And coupled with that is a concern that some of the provisions would be supportive of enabling development in locations that the council is not looking to provide the key infrastructure, and some of the challenges that we all know exist with those out-of-sequence, unplanned developments. The next bullet point, just around the ministerial intervention. So there is, in the draft submission, concerns raised about the powers that the ministers would have to intervene in council plan-making decisions. So very directive and very strong ability for ministers to intervene and direct how plans are prepared or direct changes to council plans. We've got a broad heading there, system design issues. That's really a catch-all for the integration between the two bills. So at the moment, we've got the Resource Management Act. We would now have the Planning Act and the Natural Environment Act. And so with the new system having two very comprehensive bills, this is just one of the bills. So it's pretty extensive legislation. The integration between the two, the team have certainly spotted some inconsistencies, ways that the two bills are just not interacting at a broad system level. So that's identified in the draft submission. A lot is unclear until this national policy direction is revealed, and that won't be for some time yet. Karen and Dave will have the specific timeframes if there are questions around that, but that's probably back to my initial point again, that really until we see the national direction, it's hard to know how much of this, as officers, we would support. The direction could be, and I'm sure some of it will be very useful, but some of it may be far too prescriptive and cause some problems in terms of straitjacketing Auckland and other councils into a nationally directed system that's not really fit for purpose for Auckland. A bit of a concern there. Then moving on to this new concept, which doesn't exist in the Resource Management Act. It's regulatory relief. So there is a framework that the council would have to develop under the Planning Act for giving relief to property owners who would be affected by restrictions due to significant ecological areas, outstanding landscape values, historic heritage. I think those are the three. And sites of significance to Māori. So there are four key areas where the government is saying in the bill that if the council is looking to place restrictions on private property for those four reasons, there would have to be some relief given to the landowner. The council would have to develop a framework. So there's quite a big piece of work there to put in place a framework for what the relief might be. And the bills talk about a range of things, from free resource consents through to cash payments, so direct financial compensation, through to other forms of incentives. So there are a range of things that the bills say that the council should investigate and consider, but it all is left to further decision making. We just feel that it's quite problematic and could come at a significant cost to the council if it was to continue to choose to apply restrictions on private property for those four reasons: historic heritage, sites of significance to Māori, outstanding landscapes, and ecological values. So if the council wants to continue to put those restrictions on private land, it is likely to come at a cost. Even a free resource consent is a cost cumulatively over time, but if it's financial payments because of loss of property value, and that's potentially in the mix as well, that could be a real disincentive to Auckland and other councils to restrict those things that many Aucklanders think should have some restriction on private property. So concern about that. There is a fairly broad brush restriction on the ability for councils to have controls that would improve the quality of housing or commercial development. So some of our urban design controls that have been a core part of the unitary plan since the outset, that balance between allowing more height, density, growth, intensification with ensuring a quality city, which has been fundamental for Auckland for many years, is largely removed. So there's the ability to have many of the urban design controls in the unitary plan will be removed if the bills go through in the current form. And there is a reduced ability for Māori and Auckland communities at large to participate, as I mentioned previously in the earlier bullet point. Next slide, please. Last slide on areas of concern. Overall, in terms of the environment bill and its relationship to the planning bill, and that sort of tension between planning bill being enabling of growth, housing development, and the environment bill looking to protect natural environments, including many of our degraded natural environments. On balance, overall, a concern that really the emphasis has gone too much towards the growth and enabling without enough ability for council to ensure that our natural environment is protected, enhanced, and restored. Permitted activities, so there's a big shift towards enabling more things to take place without needing a resource consent. We've yet to see the detail through the national policy direction as to what that might mean, but there's certainly a signal that there'll be far more permitted activities specified by the government at a national level under the national direction that would come under the legislation. But there is a requirement that council somehow has a register of permitted activities taking place. We feel there's a cost implication of that. There are also some monitoring requirements and costs along with that shift towards things being more permitted and not needing consent. They might still need to comply with various national rules and standards, and then the council's role would be to keep a register of that, monitor that. So while there's a bit of a shift of cost away from perhaps private interests in that they wouldn't need to obtain a resource consent, some of the shifting of the cost, as we see it, would be onto the ratepayer to have a register of what's permitted, who's doing it, and monitor what they're doing. At a more technical level, under the Resource Management Act since 1991, there have been 6 different what we call activity classes, from prohibited, can't get a resource consent, to permitted, don't need a resource consent, and the 4 classes in between, which some of you will be pretty familiar, things like discretionary activities and non-complying. So the government is proposing in the planning bill to reduce, I think in the environment bill as well, that down to 4 classes: permitted, restricted discretionary, discretionary and prohibited. We feel there's probably still a role for keeping non-complying. The team can confirm that controlled. I'm not sure if we're wedded to controlled still being in the system.
Partially. Yeah, partially. I think it's context specific. There's probably a few things we would need to work through, but yeah.
Right. So broadly supporting reducing the complexity down to the 4 classes of either you can't get a consent, you don't need a consent, or the 2 in between. But there are some situations in Auckland and under things like the Waitakere Heritage Area Act that that there is some role for non-complying and controlled, but that's at a more technical level. And last but not least, that a range of transitional issues as we move from the current RMA system and the unitary plan into new system, regional spatial plan, combined plan, implications for the council's budgeting through the long-term plan, things like the uncertainty around this regulatory relief, what might that cost, and how would the council build that into its financial planning if it was choosing to continue to put restrictions on private property for heritage, ecological areas and so on. What does that cost? This register of permitted activities, what is the cost of that? There are certainly some costs there, but it's not clear what that cost might be. So some of the challenges there in terms of council factoring that into its long-term plan decisions, coupled with indications about rates cap and so on. So integrating with that other reform that the government's taking through. So those are the broad areas of concern. Obviously the submission has the detail in behind that. We've got Karen and Dave here who can answer some of the questions that you might have, and we do have some of our subject matter experts online who can jump in if need be. Thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you very much. And yeah, it is a very fulsome submission, or kind of two submissions. I'm sure everyone has read all 300 pages. But no, it is it will affect everything we do going forward. So it is important to get as many of our points in there. And thank you for including a lot of the feedback from members of the committee as well. Right, we have some questions already. Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, team. This is quite a good submission, I think. But my question is, I'm going to put this as a question. My feedback is I don't think you have put into the submission one of the questions I asked in the workshop. And I know probably you're struggling to put it in, but I think it's important to put it in, which is what is the likely cost to us for this? You've talked about the fact that there will be cost, but somehow I think it's important for us to add to the submission what that might look like. For example, you've got on page 37 on the planning bill, it lists a whole bunch of things that you propose should be protected from inappropriate development. On the back of an envelope thing, if they were a cost that we had to pay back to the landowner, what would that be? Because I know that's kind of hard, but I really think it's important to give the select committee, which is where this is going first, and Parliament an understanding of, whilst they might be able, I mean, there are some good things in here, and I think that's really good to accentuate the positive. But at a time when potentially we may or may not get a rates cap, what is the cost of this combined set of regulatory frameworks to us if we want to believe we should protect things like trees or heritage or environment or sites of multi-significance or whatever? What would that cost us if we had to pay back the landowner? I know you probably say, look, you know, we haven't done that work, whatever, but we've got to give it a bit of a ballpark on versus what we've got. So that's my first question, and my second question is...
Just get maybe a first question.
Okay.
I know it is extremely...
I mean, is it?
Yes. Thank you, Councillor Simpson. I think there have been difficulties in trying to even establish that ballpark, but I'm just going to ask Dave to comment on that.
Thank you. I think there's no issue with us providing a general statement about the fact that this new system will generate a whole lot of costs, and these are the where they have been identified through the different provisions of the bill, and we can make that comment up front in each of the submissions. We've attempted to go away and look at whatever data we had on hand in terms of sort of the impacts in terms of the number of properties that might be subject to regulatory relief, as an example. We have been thinking about sort of the consenting realm as well, and saying, well, you know, what does it mean if you're in the consenting space and you need to redo how you do your business with a new registry system? Are there ways in our existing systems like the SAP software for us to somehow capture some of the information, or do we recognise that some of those systems are near the end of their life or won't be fit for purpose, and we will need nonetheless to plan within the next sort of 5 years anyway to have a new system? And what is the expectation of central government to support councils across the country with some of those new systems, because it may be that you can come up with a national system for some of these things. So those are all the points we've tried to think about over the last 6 weeks, 2 months, and there's been some of this analysis that's been done on some of the features of the bill that give us an inkling of cost. But I think what we would do here, Deputy Mayor, is make a clearer statement at the front, which will capture the fact that there is actually a combination of costs that will generate a significant matter for all councils around New Zealand to consider at various levels.
I also think if I could just do by way of a follow-up, give some examples, you know, give some examples. A property X here, planning rules say you can go up to 10 stories, but, you know, because of whatever, it's only going to be, the Mayor said this very simply, 5 stories, we'd have to pay the difference and that would cost us. And you could, you know, just there isn't the tangible figure that I think will make it really clear about what this means for us. You know, I think that's the first thing. And also the development of the framework. We must have done frameworks. I mean, you guys have been here for a while, all of you. What's Phil? What's that kind of cost? Just to give it a bit of an idea on the framework around it too. I just think that's a really important part. I do believe, you know, on one hand you've got private property rights, and I get that, but on the other hand, you know, if we're planning a city that has protections in certain ways, and that's going to cost us, the risk, and I think you've said this yourself, is that we actually we don't protect this stuff because it comes at a cost to us that we just think actually it's too prohibitive. And I think that really needs to be quite clear. Thank you.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor. And probably out of order, but just a comment. I think, and I have discussed this with the team, the issue is we have thousands of SEAs, we've got streams across properties, we've got Maungi view shafts that would already do that and have been in place for decades. And so the retrospective nature, we'd end up in court almost on every property, because my assumption would be you'd have to go, well, was that property already worth less because it had less developable capability, so we're already charging rates lower, or could someone prove that because you've not let me build over my stream, that I couldn't put the extra room on? So it will be tens of millions of dollars if it goes ahead in the way it's written, and that would blow our rates cap immediately.
So to be helpful, by way of going back, so I think we need to highlight the problem and then highlight a solution. What are we saying back? This is what you want to do. Ultimately, we understand what you want to do. Maybe you look at it a different way. That's kind of where I'm coming from.
Thank you. They're really helpful comments. And I think the point about if we can put examples around potential impact, we'll certainly look at that as well.
Kia ora. Thank you. Councillor Newman.
Thank you. Are the non-notified consents, resource consents, are they discoverable?
Non-notified resource consents under Log Government Official Information and Meetings Act, absolutely. Anyone can get in touch, and we do it all the time. We provide copies of decisions on resource consents to members of the public on a weekly basis. Yep.
And approximately, I know that you're up to September 2025, so you might not have the full year yet, but how many resource consents, how many non-notified resource consents were sought and issued in raw numbers, and then what's the raw number for non-complying, and the control consents? Do you have the raw numbers for those?
It's roughly between 12 and 15,000 resource consents per annum over the last 5 years. So at just under 10% for non-complying, that's 1,200 to 1,500 non-complying consents per annum in Auckland.
Okay, look, so
mostly non-notified, as you know. Yep.
I'm not going to speak on this, but Chair, if I make the point, can I make a suggestion to you? I think the submission's quite a good one, and what I know it's a lot of paper and a lot of time for an officer to go and do this, but what I think should happen is that there should be a schedule appended to the submission that actually just lists the non-notified consents that we have issued. Don't need to give detail, just list them out. List them out, the non-complying and the controlled as well. Sorry, the non-notified, the limited notified, and the notifieds, because I think, frankly, this needs to become quite a visual argument. The argument here from Parliament is that we're far too restrictive, when in fact, if you saw in raw terms, pages and pages and pages and pages and pages and pages of non-notified consents that we are issuing every year, it gives it some context. And it demonstrates that the advice that this bill is based on is in my view fraught, given the actually quite the permissive environment within which we operate. And the reason why we do have to be rather prescriptive and restrictive on occasion is because the rest of the Auckland population is rather concerned about the effects on them. So I think that the schedule and the submission needs to reflect those numbers. In all terms, just list them out.
We can certainly do that. Yep.
Yep, good point. I think we have tried to say, I think it's 97% or something non-notified, and the government would pick out the one or two that were notified to make an example of us.
97% is not, is nothing unless you see the pages and pages and pages and pages and pages that comprise the 97%. That's what needs to be attached to the submission, and allow the select committee to argue that we weren't allowing people to do things, because we have been 97% of the time without being notified.
Thank you, Councillor. Yeah, it is mentioned in there in a way, but I think, as Councillor Newman says, if it could be tweaked slightly to make it extremely blatant that we're already doing, yeah. Whether we can attach the list as a, or I could bring in a pile, I could, yeah. Yeah. Cool. Thanks, Councillor. Hokura Member Blair.
Kia ora koutou. I'm just going to focus on the te tiriti obligations in the submission. In the first paragraph, in the third sentence, which I don't think should be understated, the council notes that Māori interests are not defined. That leads to confusion nationally and also locally here. So I think it is understated, and I think in the recommendations, council should be calling for the government to provide a definition of tangata whenua, because it is very confusing. Even in the submission, it's talking of Māori interests, it's talking of hapu, it's talking of iwi. Those are all very different things in themselves. And then the definitions we have of mana whenua are pretty opaque and obscure. So I think it would serve us all well, especially in this city, in this region, that we ask for a definition of tangata whenua and what that actually means, so that it can be less confusing.
So we have made that perhaps somewhere else in the submission, that observation, but if we need to bring that a bit more clearer to the front, we can certainly do that. Thanks, Member Bear.
Kia ora, thank you. Mayor Brown.
Okay, good work for what you're trying to do. Make a submission on something that's rushed and which will almost certainly be a shambles later on in the year. There's almost, it queries the definition of property rights. I hear lots and lots of things from National about property rights. Once you get into the compensation stuff there, it gets really murky. What are your property rights? So for instance, you got a property, and I mean, most of us around here own land here and there. So if the property's currently got an allowance to have 5-storey buildings on it, and we change that to 10-storey buildings, that property is going to go up in value. Do we get a share of that back from the owner? Because you've got to put it the other way around. They don't get it the same. Because they're going to think about, if on the other hand, if I had the right to go 10 stories, and now we're going to cut it to 5 stories, how much of that extra loss of value do we give them? And so we're about to enter PC 120 with intensification rules, which all those people who are living in the lovely tree-lined streets of Mount Eden, when they suddenly find that they can go up to 20 stories, they mightn't feel so bad about it if all of a sudden their property's worth a lot more. But they mightn't feel so good about it if we get a fair share of that. So I think an example on the basis of a property that goes from 5 to 10 and one that goes from 10 to 5, who pays and how much? Because they're giving me lessons about, I don't think that the planning is actually part of your property right, but it affects property rights. And so this is very dangerous. I mean, if the interpretation, and there'll be lawyers sniffing around a few bucks here, mate. I mean, you can see them. If I can work it out, a lawyer certainly can. There's an opportunity here, so we'll be leading a major Epsom-based claim on the council for the huge increase in value as a result of intensification. We get a whopping bill for $50 million. And now where do you go? Have they hoisted themselves on this one? So I want to ask that question in there, because I don't think they've thought that through. Compensation goes two ways. If we reduce your value by doing something or other, they're going to say we've got to pay. If we increase the value by doing something or other, do we get it? No. Do the rest of us get it? Well, we should. You can't have it both ways. So, you know, if you buy and sell something or other, there's a buyer and there's a seller and everything there. So I want to just concentrate on, does this affect the definition of property rights? Because property rights are a bit like rights under the treaty. They're not very well defined. Okay.
Kia ora, Mayor, thank you, good point. So yeah, something, I think we did maybe discuss it after the Mayor's comment in the workshop, around there's no value capture or anything considered the other way, which would have been nice for the City Rail Link and other, you know, council interventions. So yeah, just putting that in there, acknowledging we only pay when it goes more restrictive, which seems the opposite of what they're trying to do. Councillor Gillen, kia ora. No? No? Might have been stretching. Hukura Member Wilson.
Kia ora, thank you. Have to say it was really, really helpful. John and Louise, with your team being there at the workshop, that allowed me, anyway, to get my head across the whole range, which I think somebody said is 700 plus papers, so thank you for that. In terms of what's been produced and the fact that it's in by Friday, I understand it to be exactly what it is, a submission that needs to be in by Friday, and the detail necessarily will come later. I agree absolutely with the notion of greater visibility. I think that's important. I'm going to talk to the Haukura script in terms of definition. Not at this juncture, I wouldn't have thought that has already been expressed. I just have a couple of queries that I did moot Dave in the workshop around the significance of this for Māori generally, and the fact that feedback had only been provided by one mana whenua iwi. So not in let do some more now, but coming up, because there's going to be work that needs to be done, making sure potentially that there's some consideration for the wider feedback, given that it was done pre-Christmas. That would be very helpful. So all I'm trying to do, it is what it is now. Look, I was very interested in the kōrero around financials, and I was thinking in my head while the kōrero was held by Councillor Simpson and Newman, there is, of course, the notion of litigation reputationally as well for council and mana whenua iwi that probably could be quite easily looked at in a couple of the examples, which are a greater cost than many would expect it to be. So if the notion is around visibility, I'm not saying do it now before the submission, but if it helps solidify in the main, I guess you've covered as much as you can cover given the time here. I do agree in the notion of the financial implications as well, and potentially for us that's a biggie, the litigation council and or iwi, in terms of as they operate what that could end up for iwi themselves and also for council themselves, and what it will do to the reputation of Auckland Council. So maybe I just need to have a notion, you haven't got a plan because you haven't got your submission in yet, but an acknowledgement that those things will be looked at moving forward past this period. Kia ora.
Kia ora, yes, and firstly, we have got a second submission, a completed submission from one mana whenua entity in the last couple of days. So it was helpful to refer to as well, and that's a lot of alignment between the council's expression and the two iwi that we have got some feedback from, so that's good. Looking ahead, I actually have been thinking about that actually, because of course we have the select committee, obviously, and before then there may be some opportunity to swap notes, so to speak, between certain parties, and obviously do some further work, some further analysis, and put our representatives who are presenting to the select committee with some additional information that could help support their arguments. So just to agree that there is an opportunity, I think, looking ahead for us to And also, given that this is a journey of the next couple of years, for mana whenua and the community in general to get their head around all this stuff, it's a big deal. So I think there will be an opportunity for us to have some further discussions with each of the iwi concerned with this as part of our council journey. So, yeah.
Kia ora, Member Wilson. Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, Chair. I've got two questions. One's we've got a lot of land zoned at the moment that perhaps owned by Ma and Pa, and they haven't subdivided it because they can't get the numbers to stack up. So even with the removal perhaps of some consenting hurdles to go through, there'll be other balances there, obviously development contributions, levies going to come into play, insurances to protect against building quality, etc., etc. So in terms of actually activating those landowners to develop their land and put some houses on them, which are not incentivised so much to do at the moment, have we got a feel of around the costings in terms of the savings that are likely to come across the line for those ma and pas that will incentivise them that it's worth doing it and they can sell the house for a profit? That's my first question.
Yeah, it probably comes to some of Councillor Newman's point too, that it's only a small percentage
Through
now.
the Chair, until we see the detail of the this national policy direction, you know, we have an NPS urban development, as you know. So under the new legislation, there'll be a full suite of national direction on everything from coastal issues to freshwater management to housing and urban development. Until we see the detail around what the government's saying should be permitted or still needs a consent, it's impossible to say whether this would result in some savings for mum and dad type developers looking to do a subdivision. But it's really unlikely to tip the balance just on consenting fees alone for a development. I mean, it may in some small number of cases, but overall it's things like the zoning that applies, which we're addressing through things like Plan Change 120 and things like that make the biggest difference to the viability of doing a development in that case. But yeah, I guess my key point is until we see the detail, it's very hard to comment on will this make it more viable for development or not.
That's a fair answer. And my second question was around, I guess it's more around staff welfare in the planning department, Chair, and that's we're having to pivot time and time again at the moment, and I have a concern around the workloads that are having to be pumped through that's new versus business as usual. There's still building going on, we're still having to use the planning staff, etc., just to do our business as usual, and we've got all this extra work on top of that. So can you give me some feel, just through you, Chair, if I could ask a question about the, I guess for want of a better word, the well-being and the ability and the capabilities of our staff to cope with this, and how long can that be sustained for? I just have a concern in that area.
Kia ora, Councillor Sayers. Good question, and I know that staff don't always like telling us they're under pressure, but I would say, in my experience on those floors, with the constant change the last 5 years under both governments, it's taking a huge toll. I get emails at weekends, nights, all sorts, trying to do submissions as well as, like you say, business as usual. The same people reviewing all those consents are the ones trying to change and react and probably train up their staff. But maybe, Megan or Phil, if you'd want to comment within what you feel comfortable with in a public setting.
Sure. Thank you, and thanks for the question. It is, certainly for John, Louise and I, as leaders and our colleagues, it is uppermost in our mind in terms of our staff. It has been a very busy area, this area, for the last few years, and it is undergoing a change. So it is absolutely having an impact on the staff, whether it's the direct planning staff or the colleagues across the organisation that feed into all of this work. We are really conscious there are continued changes happening, and as John and Louise mentioned, the connections between the two bills and also the transitions, what might be happening in the next 3 to 5 years as we transition into a new regime, which we have a level of support for because we know there are problems with the current one. nonetheless, all of that, if done poorly, and there is a likelihood that there will definitely be some difficult times, it could create enormous stresses and real imposition, I think, on us as a council, and therefore as staff, our ability to then advise you. So I am very conscious of that. Staff do an amazing job, but it can be quite a difficult space, and I do anticipate that will continue for quite some time.
Megan, thank you for that answer. It's also the other side of the coin too is customer service, right? So being able to get back to the actual people that are expecting the services from us as well, and if potentially they could see, a slide potentially, in terms of our delivery to them as well. So that's the other side for Megan.
Yeah, look, we need to be really transparent if we could see that might be coming for whatever reason. So I think it's a fair call. No one would set out to kind of reduce our service levels, but if it becomes an issue, then obviously we do need to deal with that. Yep.
Yeah, and it's mentioned in the submission too, the broader tension between this trying to speed to maybe improve something for a developer or a property owner also reduces what the community, mana whenua, the neighbours might have as input, which then comes to us in our inboxes, because people do currently expect a lot more of a say than under the current RMA allows. So it's always a tension for us to be dealing with. Councillor Turner.
Thank you very much. I don't know if it's a good submission or not, which says a lot more about me than you guys, of course. I tried to, analyse some of it, but, when you see things there like the inward bound, the inland boundary of a property that crosses a stream with a 1 kilometre something or other, and it should be multiplied by 5 times the mouth, I presume, of the river, you got me, why it's in there, I don't know, compared to the questions here today, which have, surely we could have got it down to 100 pages, I would have been better off. So what I need to focus on is just some of the stuff in my area that's been rattling around because of this. So for instance, the Waitaka Ranges Heritage Area, we still have a rural-urban boundary in that area, correct? And does that rural-urban boundary match the boundary of the heritage area right now?
Through the Chair, Councillor Turner, I think it largely does reflect it, but there may be some slight anomalies in parts. I don't think it's a strict mapping of the rural urban boundary with the ranges area, but in large parts of it they do align in the same place.
Okay, so we tend to talk about the Waitaka Ranges Heritage Area, bam, just like that, and yet it's quite a convoluted, multifaceted area, really. 17,000 hectares of regional parks, so we're not going to have any, cut by 1,000, death by 1,000 or 500 slashes there. It's got 17,000 hectares of private land, but of that it kind of divides up between the foothills and Titirangi and those bush living areas, which are a different sort of property. So where does the protection really come from? Is losing the rub the real worry that should be?
Maybe the risk we've identified specifically, which is why we've raised it in the submissions, is that removing the activity classes will have a bearing on how you give effect to the Waitaka Ranges legislation. And so what we're trying to signal here is that I don't think officials in Wellington have necessarily recognised the implications of just removing some of these activity classes and what focused impact that will have on the implementation of what's expected by the Waitaka Ranges Protection Bill or Act.
Okay. Would we not fix any of those problems we run into with our spatial plan? Could we not, once we've identified that some things from this process that the government's asking us to submit on have been sorted, we've then got time to do a spatial plan or some time, would that not be our ability to sort the issues we have, unforeseen issues that come along?
So staff have had a bit of a chat about removing controlled activity classes and what workarounds might be available to still give effect to the legislation for the Waitakere Ranges. So there are things that we're sort of looking at in terms of contingencies, what could happen. I guess what we really need to see is how central government takes this point on with the submission point that we're making here, which is still just simply to try and get them to acknowledge there are things here that you haven't seemingly looked at. Could you please, be clear as to making a decision that's actually going to take into account what the legislation for the Waitakere Ranges says and how it should be given effect to.
Just second to last question. So, but the Waitakere Ranges is very, as the word nuanced, it's quite subtle in the fact that it has achieved restricted intensification by without actually saying no intensification. Have we got other areas around the city where that complexity will be mixed up with this?
Well, the other area that's been identified is not recognition of the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park legislation as well. So there are a couple of examples where there is bespoke legislation that hasn't been really acknowledged by the staff involved in developing the bills. And I guess the question here is, can you please consider that, make a decision whatever way you want. But the point is that if you do that, it has certain implications for how we do give effect to, in the case of the Waitakeres, the expectations in the legislation for that area.
Okay, last question, and I kept, as I read through some of it, and kind of it triggered stuff in me as a consumer, and you kind of think to yourself, well, what's the driver of, what are they trying to fix here? So these compensations, particularly like we talk here about an SEA, I have been fighting for a lot of people and quite vocal about the cost of consents. And, I can quote one property where they got all their consents and they were about to have, I think it was one of the building companies, Lockwood or something, put the building on there, and then they found, oh no, you need a consent to cross a 1 metre SEA to get your power from the pole to the site. That cost $30,000. So these compensations, would I be right to say that they're a reaction to some of these situations?
I would not be surprised because, as we've talked about before, the framing of the regulatory relief provisions is somewhat with a presumption that it's to address negative impacts as opposed to recognising the positive benefits that some of the overlays or whatever might provide, or an SEA. And just to pick up on your point, yes, one of the options that would be available under the regulatory relief proposals is to address the issue of crossing a 1 metre SEA boundary, maybe reducing the consent fees, for example. So that would be something that could be considered in terms of the framing of this provision. Can I also just quickly take the opportunity to note on your Rivermouth example at the start of this conversation that some of the description that you outlined was the current situation, and what they're looking for is some pragmatic solutions to how Rivermouth definition is made. So whether it might be a bend in the river might be a more practical, or a bridge might be a more practical recognition of where a boundary is than maybe the salinity of where freshwater and seawater meets. So there are some aspects of the bill here, Councillor Turner, that are positive, and we've highlighted that those are good things. But equally, there are some things here that are really testing what the bills are trying, what are the problem definitions that this bill is, or bills are trying to address.
Thank you, I think.
Good, Councillor. Councillor Ferry.
Kia ora, thanks. And thanks for all your work on this. It is huge. And I've got sort of 3 questions. And the first goes to the discussion we were having earlier around the regulatory relief aspect. And, I guess expanding on some of the points that my colleagues have already made about the quantum of the impact, financial impact, and how can we possibly measure that or give some size to that in the submission? And I think you've spoken really well to the limitations of that. I wanted to, I guess, ask a question around, obviously, you know, if there is going to be a cost to council from that regime, and it looks like there would be, that presents, is that correct, an unfunded mandate in terms of, you know, like we don't currently have a budget for it. Is that correct?
Well, that is correct. We don't currently budget for regulatory relief for matters in the unitary plan at present. So, yeah. Just one point to make. We do, for historic heritage, have a free resource consent service that's been in place. It goes back many years. So, you know, there is a free resource consent for the relatively small number of people looking to apply to modify heritage buildings. So I guess to that extent there is some allowance for that in our budget, but the broader notion of compensation relief, rates relief, cash payments, those sort of things the government's referring to, certainly there's no budget for that.
Okay.
Dave?
Yeah, maybe just a bit of a slight segue, but maybe answering that is that we obviously have grant programs for certain environmental outcomes. So it might be a case of, if you're sitting here on the council table, you might want to look at your budget and ask the question, do we use some of the money that might already be given under grants programs for some regulatory relief provisions if you're trying to balance the book. So there's a risk here about what incentives that provide to members around this kind of a committee as to what decisions they make. So I generally just endorse what John said, but I just wanted to let you know that there is these other ways that the council tries to achieve some of these outcomes, particularly in the environment space and in probably in the Maori space as well, sites of significance. So
is it fair to say then that without a budget line, and I mean, I don't think in terms of our process and our timelines and the timelines for this, we would be unlikely to be able to put a line in the annual plan budget. We might be able to for the long-term plan, but is what you're saying, Dave, that potentially there's some opportunity cost there too in the short term until we could have a specific budget line? Is that?
Yes, generally. I think the other point is that the bills envisage a regulatory framework being developed by the council, I believe. It's not nationally.
So there's the cost of developing that framework as well.
So there's a cost of that framework being developed, and that would that would take time. And so, you know, thinking about when you might actually have an opportunity to introduce something into an LTP, for example, you might have to come up with a contingency number, and you get more certainty on that as time goes by and your framework's actually in place.
And that would be the same with the permitted activity registers as well? Yeah, that's unbudgeted, and we would need to find money to do that.
As it currently stands, yes. And I think, as I alluded to, the only way we would try and look at a workaround would be to ask our consent staff to use existing software. My view and the view of others is that's unlikely to be fit for purpose. Right. And so it wouldn't be too long before staff would be asking the councillors, we might need to consider how this shortfall, as it were, is addressed.
Cool. So significant unfunded mandate there potentially. Well, yes. So with the regulatory relief, I wanted to explore a little bit more whether this potentially opens us up to a situation where people apply to develop knowing that they will be turned down because of protection for the purpose of getting regulatory relief.
I think there are a number of incentives here for people to play the system a bit. I think that hasn't really been, and I think it comes back to better defining what the right is that you think you might have.
Yeah.
And it goes to the Mayor's point earlier, what exactly are we actually talking about here in terms of what is the right that you might have? And what qualifications are considered reasonable to your exercise of your activities on your land? What is reasonable and what is significant impact? These are things that will be no doubt tested through the courts. So we do expect around the country, a number of council staff have observed that litigation is, 100% expected.
So then is it fair to say that we probably need an increased budget for litigation as well?
I think it'd be fair to say there's a whole number of elements that, as we assess where they fall, we're going to have to look at the cost of implementation, and that goes across a range of the measures that are proposed.
Okay. And so the other thing was, and I think, Dave, your point to the Mayor's point around determining what the right is, the other issue I had was determining the value. Obviously, we do this revaluation process, right? That determines what the value is based on a range of measures looking at the current property in the market. But the value of development, if the protection did not exist, that is something that is far harder potentially to measure. There aren't necessarily the tools in place. So what would we do in terms of developing some kind of understanding of and I guess again we probably end up in litigation, at least to start with, around the impact of protection on value. And one of the things that's come up in the Plan Change 120 debate, John's very aware of this, is special character neighbourhoods where I have people who can see themselves selling in the next 2 or 3 years and would welcome the value uplift that they perceive they would get from being able to develop, say, to 6 stories. And then I have neighbours who want the value of their character property protected. We just don't know where those values are going to land. But in this case, we're potentially going to be asked to calculate a value if a protection did not exist. Am I making sense with that question? And how would we do that?
Thanks, Councillor Ferry. It's similar to the Mayor's point. It's so nebulous, difficult to pin down exactly what this relief might be. What's the baseline or benchmark that you start from in terms of your current property right? What does the restriction do to that? Is it loss just in property value or change in property value? Yeah. Or is it change in potential development, and what's the yield that you might be able to achieve if there wasn't the restriction? It's not defined in the bill. It's left to council to develop a framework, but there's a very clear set of criteria there that the framework must consider these things like loss in value, loss in, what is the constraint doing? So councils are left to come up with it, but it's open to, if we don't do it in a robust way, it's open to challenge through a planning tribunal, and that planning tribunal would ultimately make the decision about whether council is giving the right relief, enough relief, the right type of relief, or not. So, it's all very problematic in our view.
Okay, so more litigation again.
Yeah.
Okay, and then I had a question about something completely different. Tree protection. And I know we have got some stuff in there for tree protection, which is great. I just wanted to make the comment that this is probably the issue I have had most consistently raised with me since I was first elected in 2010, concerns about tree protection, particularly subsequent after the changes made to the RMA. The contribution that trees make to the heat issue, bringing the heat down on the street, but also for individual properties. Do we feel that the bill, I know we have got some stuff in there about tree protection. Did you maybe just want to speak to that a little bit? Because I think that will be of interest to people about, at the moment, there's not really anything proposed to continue tree protection, but we're saying there should be. Do you want to just speak to that briefly? Because I think that will be of interest.
Yes, there's nothing in the bills at the moment around tree protection. We have had discussion with Ministry for the Environment staff, and they did say something about, well, it can be covered under significant historic heritage, but we don't have anything concrete at the moment. We have raised it as an issue. There's 2 points. We're asking for specific provisions for protecting notable trees and groups of notable trees, and also an amendment to the significant historic heritage part, which will enable protection of heritage trees.
Thank you.
And we'll also raise it as a broader amenity, just in terms of how you look at quality urban or rural form. So we've covered it off in a number of different places throughout the submissions. Yeah, we'll just have to keep banging that drum, I think.
Great. Thanks very much.
Kia ora. And we've got 3 more questions, and we'll try and cut it off there, because we did have a long discussion at the workshop as well. So we've got Councillor Henderson. Sorry, 4 more questions. Councillor Henderson.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of quickies, because it's quite a complex thing, but I just want to get a couple of things really clear, particularly for my constituents that have had concerns. There was an article in the paper recently claiming the reforms threaten the protection of the Waitakere Ranges heritage area. As a general statement, is that true, or what are your concerns around this in a general way that I can share with the public?
We genuinely think this was an oversight, because the previous bills that were repealed, the Natural Environment Bill, did refer to the Waitakere Ranges Heritage Area Act. So we've pointed it out in our submission.
That's wonderful. Yes, I noted several points in there you have, and thank you. I really appreciate that. I suppose that kind of covers my second question a little bit. I'll just throw it out there. If non-complying status is no longer a control, do you think this will affect the Heritage Area Act, or is it simply they just didn't think of it?
Yeah, so as we've highlighted, we are concerned that it is an oversight, but we also recognise in our analysis that removal of the non-complying activity status will have a bearing on giving effect to the Waitakere Ranges Heritage Protection Act.
The good people of West Auckland, thank you for picking that up, and thanks, Chair.
Kia ora, Councillor. Thank you. Councillor Fletcher, online. Kia ora.
Thank you, Chair. I want, as others have done, to really acknowledge what an extraordinary amount of work has been undertaken by staff here. Some of my questions have already been answered, but I guess the question that I've got, and it's probably following on from that of the Deputy Mayor, along with Councillor Williamson, I had the experience of being in Parliament at the time of the introduction of the RMA, and then later chaired a committee, and that introduction was done by the then Minister, Simon Upton, who interestingly is now the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, so it'll be very interesting to read his submission on this. But what was very clear in the early inquiries that we had into the introduction of the RMA was unintended consequences. So I'm not wanting everyone to quantify all of the unfunded mandates and everything else, because I think that would be near impossible. But I'm particularly interested in out-of-sequence development. And along with the suggestion by the Deputy Mayor that there be some case studies or there be something to help. Often parliamentary legislation can be undertaken where not everybody, not all of the elected members understand the consequences. And I wondered, would there be any specific case studies that officers would like to highlight where there are out-of-sequence developments that have huge ramifications on infrastructure? That's my first question. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher, through the Chair. We certainly have a number of those examples, so we can certainly go and talk to the team and see if we can pull together something useful to include in the submission, if that's the committee's desire, just to give the government some clear examples of where land has been rezoned without the infrastructure in place, and some of the challenges that causes, not just the council, but also the landowners themselves, with gone through a process to have the land rezoned, all the expectations that go along with that, and 5, 10, 15 years down the line, they're still struggling because the infrastructure just isn't arriving. So, yeah, we've got some.
So, within that, you could come up with something where you can actually spell out exactly what the cost to Auckland Council was. So I'm appreciating you can't do it across the board, but you can potentially within a couple of case studies. And I know the pressure you've been under to get the submission to the point that it is, and I really appreciate the work. But is there anything that springs to mind immediately?
Councillor Fletcher, I might just chip in and just note that our planning colleagues have provided advice directly to officials so far, I believe, but John, we can certainly look at what has been collated already, and maybe we can throw in a couple of examples to illustrate this point.
I would really appreciate that, and I think it will give some substance to our submission. It does annoy me at times that we're not forceful enough at pushing back at government. Plan Change 120 springs to mind. The second question I've got is, what is likely going to be the consequence of a response from government on Plan Change 120 with so much of this currently in the air? We don't know where it's finally going to land. Do you want to make a comment on that?
Oh, through the chair, I'm happy to take that. Councillor Fletcher, as you know, the government has announced that they want to make some changes, but that's all we know at the moment. So the best we can do is obviously continue to try and understand what that might look like. But ultimately, this comes to this whole transition issue between everything we're doing now, including Plan Change 120, and what comes once these bills become law, and once the new transition provisions come in, and to try and kind of make it all align. At the moment, it's not aligned. So look, I think my honest answer at the moment is it all feels all very tangled, and I'm very unclear about what it all looks like. But we are progressing on with Plan Change 120, knowing the government wants to do something at some point, and we'll try and find out what that is. And we know that it will get a bit sticky, I think, later in the year, when the bills come through through Parliament into Acts, and we'd have to work out what that looks like. So I'm sorry, it's a little bit of an unclear answer, but it's quite tricky.
I appreciate that, Megan. Is it your intention to try and put forward a paper at some stage that is a specific agenda item where we can talk about a lot of these balls in the air, so to speak, and Plan Change 120? Is that something for a future committee?
Look, through the chair, really happy to talk with the chair about that. I think at some point a conversation would be really helpful. I'm just trying to figure out when that time might be once we know something. But thank you, that's great. I'll talk to the chair.
Yeah. I would appreciate that. Now, you touched before on the Hauraki Golf Marine Park. Dave, I think, did. Could you speak further to that? Because that's something dear to my heart, and I just don't, again, believe that there is an understanding of the interrelationship of these changes and the omission of understanding of that. Is there an ability to speak further to that?
Yeah, I think it's really an acknowledgement that we have sort of bespoke pieces of legislation that haven't really been picked up through these bills, and so we're trying to highlight that the provisions in those bills need to be recognised and appropriately integrated into the thinking. So in terms of the Hauraki Golf and in fact any coastal marine area, we really need to see some clearer articulation of how the goals and objectives in the case of the Hauraki Golf Marine Protection or the Marine Park Act are given effect to through these new bills, and that's what we're required to do under the RMA. But you could argue, well, we're probably having some trouble articulating how well we're doing there. But I think what I'd be keen to see is that there's some sort of acknowledgement that is an omission and that they do need to be recognised, and that the objectives that you have already in the Hauraki Golf Marine Park Act need to be somehow articulated through these new bills. So there is an integration question there, Councillor Fletcher, that we need to highlight with government.
I think that's very helpful, but I wonder again, rather than just it being a technical matter that we're drawing attention to that omission, whether there's anything you could use again to highlight in a visual sense of an issue that might be dear to the government and the impact that it might have. I mean, I'm just trying to think of all of the many issues that we have running in the area of the Hauraki Golf Marine Park at the moment, whether it's Kalupa or whatever, whether it's what and why they should have been given consideration to that. Is there anything specific you can think of that could be included?
Yes, I've just seen one of my colleagues just point out that there's some nuances that we need to see in these new bills as it reflects, as it advances, for example, setbacks, coastal setbacks, for example, for development. So there are some things that we can highlight that would, in a more practical sense, sort of show the value of, the provisions we do have in the AUP, which is trying to recognise, the objectives of the Marine Park Act. But I do agree also holistically, that we can clearly articulate, and maybe it's not in the submission immediately, but we can do it through a select committee presentation, slide or something. We can make a particular point of highlighting that particular outcome and show why it's important.
Thank you very much for that, Chair. I don't need to speak to the agenda item, but again, I just want to reiterate my support for staff. This is a really huge piece of work and a really complex one, and I think they've done justice to it. But it's going to be a work in progress, I suspect, because it's just such an enormous undertaking.
Thank you, Councillor. And yes, we will, as soon as we know from the government, I think as the Mayor said yesterday, the ministers and Prime Minister weren't necessarily all on the same page with 120, so we don't necessarily know anything much yet, but as soon as we do, we will highlight that. I've also highlighted to the Minister and others that are we a special case on the other side of this legislation, because we will end up going back into plans again. So once again, they need to maybe look for the Auckland nuance as opposed to constantly assuming we are the same. So we will hopefully find something out soon. Right, the last two questions, and we'll really need to close it off there. Councillor Gillen and then Councillor Newman.
Cool, thank you, Mr. Chair. And like everyone else, I'd like to thank you for the robust draft submissions that you've put forward. Sorry, Mr. Chair, I've got three things to go through. The first of all, could you just go through what the main concerns or themes that came through from the local boards and what may have been incorporated into these draft submissions?
So the local board feedback was quite consistent. It was based on some questions that we sent out to all the local boards, and we sort of asked a couple of questions for the planning bill, a couple of questions for the natural environment bill, and we had some cross-cutting issues at the top of the survey form. And so there was about 8 or 10 questions roughly. But they were basically agreeing with concern about local voice. When I say local voice, I probably mean at a council level as well. But clearly, if you go with a highly standardised approach to plan making, where a lot of the decisions are made sort of through a Wellington process, you have less opportunity to give effect to what your community is looking to achieve at a local scale. So that's a pretty clear message. Pretty broad agreement on some of the concerns around Maori in terms of how that's expressed and how we should give effect to the treaty, and obviously the how Maori outcomes are best expressed through the council and its relationship. And what else, Karen, have I met as other obvious ones?
A lot of concerns around amenity and urban design considerations being removed. Weakened environmental protections, and the need for plans to include provisions that respond to local circumstances. In other words, the need for local flexibility.
and opposition to regulatory relief as a concept was the other thing I could just immediately think of. So I think, so maybe what I observe is that there's a lot of commonality between the views of the local boards, which we've taken those themes and put them into the submissions, and so that's integrated, and it's pretty common with what the staff were thinking, so it's all coming together nicely in that respect.
That's good. Thank you for that. My next one is the submissions talk about not supporting the removal of the non-complying activity class. This is actually one of the things I was quite pleased to see, because in my limited experience at going to hearings, hearing commissioners will they'll say, well, it's not prohibited, therefore we can do it, even though it's non-complying. So in my view, non-complying doesn't actually send a signal that things don't comply and shouldn't happen. It's actually just a small barrier that can easily be overcome because it's not prohibited, and that we should actually be saying whether things are prohibited or allowed. So do you want to comment on that, about why you think that we shouldn't, why you think that we should still have non-complying?
Thank you, Councillor Gillen, through the chair. What we're really saying is that there are some places in Auckland, or some situations, where it's still justified. It's a useful tool, but broadly speaking, there's probably agreement with what you're saying, in that we think 4 activity classes, permitted, restricted discretionary, full discretionary, or prohibited, it is reasonably workable nationally and in Auckland. But just looking at things like the Waitakere Rangers Heritage Area Act, there's some things in there that really would steer much more towards somewhere in between prohibited and full discretionary, i.e. non-complying, and in some cases controlled. So that's the emphasis in the draft submission, as I understand it, the way it's written, but we can look at that again. It's not saying that we need all 6 classes, no change. It's saying that there are some unique scenarios where there potentially is a role for something like non-complying.
Can I just, just to add on, sometimes sometimes commissioners do see it as a signal to give it a higher test, obviously. So I'm sort of countering your view. It's not always the case that commissioners will, just try and work their way around it. So I just think it's, what we've picked up, I guess, in our analysis is it just needs a bit more thinking about how this is approached. And I think we're less concerned with controlled activity being lost, but probably more concerned with non-complying at this point, probably largely because the Waitakere Rangers has been a quite bespoke area that would actually have an issue for us as a council.
Okay, thank you for that. My last one is that comments around the table and the thrust of the submissions is pretty much opposed to what's going through. I know there are some areas that we agree in and that, but on the whole, it does seem to be that we are opposing the bills, or raising concerns about quite a large number of the points in there. So do you have a view on whether we actually should be a bit tougher and say, well, actually, we oppose these bills, but if you're going to proceed, then you really need to consider this, and this. Whereas when I read at the moment, it's more of a, we support the thrust, but here are our concerns. And that also goes through to the proposed resolution here, where we're actually just approving it, whereas I would prefer that we actually said, no, we oppose, but here's our submission, and here are the points where you can make some improvements.
Yeah, well, obviously we take the feedback and direction from the committee. We have tried to acknowledge that there are some areas that we do support, and certainly in terms of the intention, but also strongly raised where the concerns are as well. So I suppose it's about just getting the balance right there in terms of the submission. Certainly the extensive, we've done both a thematic analysis and a clause-by-clause analysis. So where possible, have said where things would need to improve or where we strongly oppose that. So I think we've been quite explicit in those areas, but obviously steer from the committee as well.
Kia ora, Councillor. Last question, Councillor Newman.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just coming back, I want to come to the planning, but look, there's aspects of these bills that I do support. So for me personally, I want to put in a submission that reflects the different arguments that we need to reflect here with, but the concern that I have with the limit on the submission on the planning bill goes to the regulatory relief, and some of the issues have been touched on by Councillor Ferry. That's the only statute that I'm aware of at the moment that has a mechanism for quantifying compensation for loss of value, and that relates in relation to the taking of land, which is effectively the process is, well, there'll be a evaluation done at the time by parties, and that will inform the quantum of the compensation to be paid. I think that the bill needs to reflect that that's how the PWA works, but absent any direction from Parliament on this, I mean, I agree with Councillor Ferry. I have no idea how this will work. Is there any example of overseas jurisdictions where they have a methodology for quantifying the opportunity cost and what that would be, and does that get quantified at the drafting of a 10-year plan, a 30-year plan, or does that have to get quantified at the time that you know, some sort of planning framework says, well, thou shalt not develop here? I mean, is there anything that we have that we could point to? Because I think that the submission needs to point to the fact that the PWA provides prescription for how this works in relation to the taking of land, and that is an evaluation done at the time that the land is required. But there's nothing here to provide direction as to how you would quantify the opportunity cost, when you would quantify that cost, and the last point is how you would fund that cost. Does it come in the form of a slush fund of the 10-year plan, or is it going to be funded through an insurance scheme, or how does that get done? But those are the points that I think the submission does need to reflect. Thank you. I assume we have no examples of overseas jurisdiction where the opportunity cost is calculated?
Thanks, through the chair. Yeah, we've had a little conversation here. Certainly, you know, systems like, you know, the States and Australia, UK, other planning systems that have some similarity to our own system, we're not aware of a similar regulatory relief framework. You know, many councils choose to provide things like reduced application fees for planning approvals, that kind of thing. Possibly in the USA, we think there might be some places in the States where they have a framework like this, but no, we're not aware of any examples.
Can I just also observe that doing a valuation under the Public Works Act is a lot more simpler, inverted commas, way to give a value to a bit of land than the kinds of things that have been contemplated in the regulatory relief package here. How do you put a value on sites of significance to Māori? How do you put a value on some of the significant ecological areas that may vary as well? So the framework for regulatory relief will need a lot more work, both in central government and also by councils, in terms of how that's developed, which I think is only picking up on your point that this is a bit of a difficult area in terms of having this introduced into a bill without necessarily understanding the machinery of how this would work. So,
yeah, I couldn't find anything that's similar, and I think it will be values judgments. If you look at special character, for instance, there will be a number of people who want special character in their area, but there may be property owners or homeowners within a special character area that are able to prove that we are keeping their developability way down, and it only takes one court action to then suddenly we are having to pay out people in a special character area millions because they cannot develop to the height, maybe in Ponsonby or somewhere like that. So it becomes an interesting argument if we're having to make just cost-based decisions. Right, we are done. There was a lot of good questions, a lot of good information. Thank you to the team Now, we will update where we can through those conversations, but because this is due on Friday, we will need a quick turnaround. So I've spoken to Haukura members around that. Probably Thursday we will need to update any of those minor changes and kind of approve it on Thursday because it needs to be in by Friday. So myself and Councillor Ferry and the appointed Haukura member will get to you via email. So we will do our best to come back quickly. So kia ora. I'm not sure there is a debate on this. I think we've got Councillor Lee. I'll let you lead off. Kia ora.
I'd just like to make some comments rather than ask questions. Go now.
Perfect, absolutely.
Yes, well, I support the submissions in general, not everything, of course. But I do question the statement, rather bold statement. The council agrees Resource Management Act is no longer fit for purpose. If that's true, when did that happen? Because if I recall, only a few weeks ago, we approved the notification of Plan Change 120, and that sparked off over 10,000, according to the submissions from obviously anxious Aucklanders. So, and there's a lot of cost imposed on the community with this sort of thing. So I'd be very careful about saying the RMA is no longer fit for purpose, yet we've got the people of Auckland to produce 10,000 submissions in defence of their property values in essence. I'd be careful about that one. Again, another small point, but I think it's quite important if we are kind of reading the room nationally. The mihi, the English translation of which talks about Auckland, loved by so many people, the envy of thousands, and we send that down to Wellington to be read by MPs from Central Otago or South Canterbury or the far north, and to be honest with you, it doesn't go down that well, that kind of bragging approach to Auckland. You know, Auckland has major problems, we know about that, and a lot of people don't envy Auckland right now. So I think we need to be a little bit careful here the way we promote ourselves. As I say, most of the points made are reasonable, that this is a paradigm shift. At first sounds like more hyperbole coming from the Auckland Council, but actually, when you think about it, it is right that the government is so explicit in wanting to control virtually everything. It's been going on for years, of course. The unitary plan was essentially pushed through by the central government at the time, and then we saw the last government push through MDRS, which ended up in Plan Change 78, and so on. So that tendency's been going for a while. What I find interesting at our submission when it comes to spatial planning, spatial plan is going to be opposed everywhere, but our submission seems to neglect the fact that under, I think it's Section 79, Section 80 of the Local Government Auckland Council Amendment Act, a spatial plan is imposed by the central government on the Auckland region. And we've had two iterations of that, the last one being the Auckland Plan 2050. There's no real reference I can see about that. I would have thought one could make the point, well, we've got a really good spatial plan and we've already done that, and that was began 17 years ago, so it's not new for Auckland, but it's almost like that the spatial plan for Auckland, as it's really called, doesn't actually exist. And of course, it does for whatever one would think about it. But it doesn't seem to be mentioned, which is kind of curious. Another glaring omission, I think, there's a lot of emphasis on Maori interests, not much about public interest in general. I don't think I couldn't see the word at all, or the public's or individual householders' property rights. The property rights issues seems to be the property rights of developers to maximise their profits from their properties, but there's no real concern about our ratepayers, individual ratepayers who provide the bulk of the money for this council and local government across New Zealand, nor indeed the rights for people to have a say. Now, we've kind of said the right things about that glaring weakness in the legislation, but we kind of neglect that less than 1% of our resource consents, hundreds of resource consents, enable public notification. So perhaps that's why we're not talking about it. We can't really criticise the government when we are probably, of all the councils in New Zealand, the most restrictive on allowing people to have a say over resource management issues. They are the concerns I see. I would agree with the points made about natural character need not necessarily be high, and historic heritage need not be significant. And I agree the council is right to make the argument about protecting visual amenity and sunlight and so on. But one wonders where the staff have been reading some of the 10,000 submissions from ticked off Aucklanders about the 50-metre towers being imposed on special character areas, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. And just to make sure we did, from the comments, your comments at the workshop, Dave Allen made sure that your thoughts were added around households and their rights and private property rights. So it was definitely added after your suggestion at the workshop. So kia ora. Was there any other, no more comments? Right, oh, sorry, Councillor Filipaina.
Tēnā koe hea mana, I ended up putting it on resolve, so I don't know what happened there. Just to our staff, it'd be short and sweet because I think we have lunch after this. Yeah?
So we're going to go try and get through that.
Oh, okay.
Couple.
Okay, well then I'll just lose a little bit more
We'll have
until we finish the agenda. Just to our staff, ngā mihi kia koutou katoa, thank you for the submission. I do have concerns which have been raised by staff, but for me this is just going to be short and sweet. I have total faith in both the chair and deputy chair in regards to any submissions to the select committee to air the concerns that have been put in front of us, in particular from my perspective anyway, for the planning. And I think for me is reduced opportunity for plan input. So I'm assuming, Chair, that you and the Deputy Chair will end up focusing on the concerns that we have in front of us, in particular reduced voice for Māori and communities, which was highlighted by Councillor Lee. So I look forward to that. I want to compliment the staff again in regards to the submission around Māori interest in the Treaty of Waitangi. The points in there was valid. If I then go to the next sheet or PowerPoint presentation on concerns, the highlight for me, and I know you'll be putting those in front of the select committee, is the lack of ability to protect, enhance and restore degraded natural environment. So I look forward not only to the submission going through to the select committee, but more importantly, I think yourself and the deputy chair putting your comments to the select committee. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Councillor, yes, we've already signed up to ensure we do have a speaking opportunity. Kia ora. Mayor Brown.
Quick one. I found myself in agreement with Councillor Lee's statement that the fact that the Resource Management Act is completely worthless and useless is a bit of an overstatement. One of the things that's driving the government on this is the feeling that councils are holding everything up. There are 9,500 approved resource consents currently in Auckland that no one's using. And that's the state of the economy, not the resource consent. And I've found, having got quite a lot of resource consents myself, actually reading the RMA and understanding it, it's not that bad to get through. I've got them through for even things like timber treatment plants. And so I think it's perceived as a villain, but it's not that bad. I found it quite good. Just because other people don't read it and bother to find out what they've got to do, if you bother to find out what to do, it gives you a commercial advantage over the people who don't bother to read out what the thing is. So I think we should comment on the changes that they've got, but I think the statement that it's beyond its use is an overstatement, and Councillor Lee's right in that regard. Otherwise, it's suggesting that everything we've done in the last 20 years is a complete waste of time, but most of it wasn't. Thank you.
Kia ora, Mayor. Thank you. And just speak only very briefly. Yes, in my experience, when we are too strong in the language around this table, like the Treaty Principles Bill or the Local Government Act amendment changes, which we put up opposed, people don't quite like us being opposed. So have tried to take everyone's views and see that there are positives and that we're working with government. But please feel free to be stronger if you want. But it's the case, as Councillor Newman said, trying to balance everyone's views around this table and get strong opposition to the parts we oppose, as well as there are ways to improve the system clearly. But I take the Mayor's point that he believes as an applicant, in this case, that actually it's not always as cumbersome as is said. But I think the submission is clear. We'll speak to the Select Committee. I think there are some clear negative effects on environment, negative effects on community engagement, negative effects on the complete change. This bill is the Treaty Principles Bill in undercover, I guess, by stealth, because it actually completely changes the relationship with mana whenua and te tiriti that was promised not to happen through the ending of the Treaty Principles Bill. So although it's strong on settlement, it completely removes Māori say over natural resources and water and the environment, and something that has been in place for decades and decades and decades, and I think has only improved outcomes for our city. So we do need to watch that. But I think there is a lot in here. We've tried to balance everyone's views, and I acknowledge the staff for that, and we will send around and share our submission when we speak to it. And thank you. All those in favour? Any opposed? Perfect. Thank you very much. Oh, that was carried unanimously. We will have a 5-minute break. We will try and do the 2 plan changes and then come back after